Hello, my name is Rebecca York. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm the manager of learning and development at Out and Equal. And I am very excited to say that I'm joined by Chella Man, an artist, director, author, speaker, and really just inspiration to, I think, so many out there. So, Chella, before we really dig into the conversation that we're going to have, can you share more about your work, the identities you hold? And really what drives you in this.
Yes. Well, thank you for the introduction. Okay, where to begin? My identity. So, as you said, I first and foremost identify as an artist, and I've also begun to identify recently as like curious, stubborn, determined, all of those things. I really wish those kinds of identities were prioritized in the same way our identities that are politicized art. So I also identify deaf, trans masculine, genderqueer, Jewish, and Chinese, among many other things. So a lot of that shows up in my work actually and is kind of what drives me because I found with my life experiences living within these identities on a continuum, to which I mean within gender, race, sexuality, and disability, there are so many different binaries. And I found with my identities, I kind of live in this gray space within all of them. So, with my deaf identity, for example, I'm deaf, but I also have two cochlear implants. I've actually only been wearing one recently because I've been more interested in navigating deaf, predominantly signing and more capital D deaf culture in the way that they navigate the world and connecting more with my friends from that culture. So I'm kind of experimenting right now, which is why I only have one on. But all that being said, I've had a lot of different experiences within the deaf community, and I've had a lot of different experiences within the hearing community. And my entire existence kind of has been oscillating between the two, and that's true with deafness of course, but also my gender. I identify genderqueer or non-binary. I often use genderqueer because I feel like I would rather not identify as what I am not. I would rather not identify as empty space. So instead of saying I'm not binary, I would rather say I am genderqueer. I am expansive. I'm not just this negative space. Similar to my sexuality, I just don't. I mean, if I had to put a label on it, I would say pansexual, which basically just means you love anyone and everyone for whatever their body looks like, for whoever they are. Um, and then I'm biracial, which is encompasses many different things, but I typically say Chinese and Jewish. So a lot of my work deals with living in that continuum and exploring what it truly means to have to be your own representation that way, because within conventional mainstream media we often categorize everything within binaries, and because of linguistics, we begin to forget that there's more, that we can expand. And we also, because we are unaware that way, we don't allow ourselves permission to claim that space. So my work deals with taking up space in that way, claiming it, and encouraging others to do the same.
Well, I love everything that you just said. And wow, did you tee us up perfectly for everything else that we're going to cover? I'm going to go back to a few of those pieces that you mentioned, those like nuggets of wisdom later on. We're going to come back to all of this. I do want to give a quick shout out because I know your book is called Continuum. We will ask you a bit
Yes.
more about that later and really how folks can start to share their own stories in that way and own their own identities in the way that I think you so authentically do. Um, I want to go back really quickly and clarify for folks in the audience who might not know the difference between capital D deaf and little d deaf, because I know there is a distinction in community that sometimes gets lost on hearing folks.
Absolutely. So thank you for that pause. So little d deaf is typically a deaf person who doesn't feel deeply connected to their identity as being deaf, or more so, actually, let me rephrase. Little d deaf is more so when people don't deeply resonate or connect with deaf culture. And capital D deaf is when you do. So although I didn't grow up in a deaf family or go to a deaf institution, unfortunately, I identify capital D deaf because it truly impacts my life and every moment I have on this earth. And informs all of the experiences I have in this world. So I feel like how could I not identify capital D deaf with it influencing everything in my life? But I definitely am stepping into deaf culture more so because I didn't have the privilege of doing that growing up. I was surrounded by hearing people. So having access to deaf culture wasn't unfortunately something I had, and I'm now building now more than ever. I think my community is as big as it's ever been, which is incredible. So that's the difference essentially. But I love to leave the I I think it's very important to emphasize that any deaf person can identify as either, and it's really up to them how they define it, and not anyone else's job or responsibility to gatekeep that word.
Yeah, that idea of self-definition as being really critical in your identity, or I say your, but generally everyone's identity formation. Um, yeah,
Right.
yeah, so that actually leads into another question I have, which is something that I run into a lot in the work I do, educating our partners on LGBTQ identity, intersectionality, is this question of labels. Do we need them? Have we outgrown them? Was that so 2000s? Like, where are we in this conversation? And I know that you are very vocal about thinking that labels do still serve a purpose. And I admit I also agree with that today. So I'm wondering if you could share more about really what power labels can have in facilitating the search for community for those folks who might still be on the fence.
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. It's a really beautiful question. And there's so much to say about this. I think the answer I would have for this is also on a continuum. Yes, I believe that labels are so important because when we are at the basics, right, that's how we learn. We need words, we need concepts to connect to so that we can understand our experiences. And not only that, but potentially connect to other community as well. When you find a word, not only do you finally have some kind of framework for what potentially in identity, what you may be or how you may want to identify or define yourself, but additionally, you have this epiphany that, or I had this epiphany that if this word exists, that means there's so many people behind this word that also connect with it. So I'm not alone. So language also provides that expansion, that abundance of connection, essentially. I think it can be very dangerous at the same time. And that revolves around what we touched upon before with little d, big D, deaf identities, which is gatekeeping. You know, I believe that to an extent, language catalyzes connection, but it can also limit you. If people or you yourself feel like, okay, to identify this way, these are all the things that I must be, which is dangerous because it creates a stereotype. And humans are fluid. We are continuously adapting and continuously changing. So to cement yourself as this one thing that you saw on paper that one time granted you liberation, it's a beautiful thing, but you also need to be able to allow yourself to change, and other people around you also need to recognize that that's a human thing that will happen to people, and it's okay to identify this way one day and this way another day, because what in this world doesn't change? That is literally the only inevitable truth we have in this world, is that things just change. And as soon as we accept that, I think it would eradicate a lot of unnecessary stress and pressures. So, going back to the question, Language is beautiful, but it's also very scary at the same time.
Yeah. There's a lot of power in these words and in the good and the bad that can come from them. While you were talking about change, I was reminded of Octavia Butler, who is a author, a Black Afrofuturist, and a lot of
I know what quote you're thinking of, I think.
yeah, where she says, "All that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you," um, which just right, it just hits right on the money here. Um, as we're thinking through labels and fluidity, there is something to really explore there around gender fluidity. And I loved what you said about not defining your gender as an absence or as a blank spot, that non-binary in its literal term, literal form is. So I'm really curious to know, how did you come to understand this concept of gender? And how do you explain it to people who are still stuck in that one option or two options, or genderqueer has to look androgynous? How do you move beyond that?
Great, great question. I think there are many layers to this. Growing up, the first thing I had and the only way I had to understand gender was personally and inherently. I could not yet grasp the systemic oppression of the gender binary and also the historical oppression of the gender binary, because when you are 13, you're not really able to conceive what history is because you haven't even been around that long, you know? So when you're younger, what you know though is you. You know what you want, you know what you feel. And I truly believe that we know that from the day that we're born. And it's the world and the world social, political, economic constructs that confuse us so much about what we just want in this world. So growing up, I've always known to an extent. I just never had the language or the resources or the community represented around me to fully understand what exactly I was feeling, even though I was feeling it, and that was completely valid. And I wish that was all I needed to explain myself. But essentially, I just did not fit with these preconceived notions of to be a boy, you must wear blue. You must dress this way. Your mannerisms have to be this way. These are the kinds of people that your heart can fall in love with. These are the kinds of people you can find sexually attractive. And girl, etc. You know how it goes. Um, I thought that was ridiculous. I was like, this just doesn't make sense, you know? And it feels very conflicting when adults tell you they want you to be who you are, except not like that. And as soon as I discovered queer terminology, which took a long time because I grew up in a very conservative town in central Pennsylvania, I sum it up by saying Trump came to speak at my high school. That's the kind of area it was. It was very not safe, I would say, for a disabled, queer, BIPOC person to grow up in. But it's what I had. So when I was 16, because of the internet and social media, that is where I first saw queer terminology and representation in a way that was positive. Because, of course, I've heard about it before, like in bits and pieces, but it was always carrying shame. And so the first time I saw it in a way that was authentic and just true was when I was 16. And when I figured out what pansexual meant, that you can just like anyone and everyone and not have it be filled with so much shame, and that there are actually people doing it. Not only are they doing it, but they're happy. They're living their full lives. They're married. They have families, they have people who support them. That blew my mind and allowed me to step into the feelings that I've always had, you know? And once I was able to fully understand my own feelings because of that representation in language, when I felt ready, which was not right away. I could then articulate that to other people. And it almost didn't even feel like a choice. It was bubbling inside of me for most of my life that I needed to share it. And so I did. And luckily, I've been so privileged that my family, my biological family, has been incredible, which is not what most queer people can say about their experiences. But unfortunately, like the external world, the society I was in, didn't really support as much considering where I was. But I also, of course, built a chosen family. And I'm grateful to say that there's still people I hold very close to my heart today. Um, from there, I moved to New York City, which basically felt like time traveling like a billion years into the future. I feel like it was. And just seeing trans people exist and breathe, and queer people walk down the street holding hands and no one batted an eye, that just that just that existence healed so much for me being here in New York City. And having now understood myself, my identity, and understanding that I myself was trans masculine and genderqueer, I was then able to start to begin to look outside of me and realize all the systemic cycles that were happening around me and why things were the way they were and why other people have so much shame and don't understand trans people and basically act from a place rooted in deep, deep fear. And so it took a lot of different uncoverings, beginning with myself and now systemically. And I hope to share both facets because you kind of need all the information to fully understand how we got here. Because queer trans people have always been around. Queer trans people have been around longer than what people categorize as straight and cis. Indigenous individuals, like indigenous cultures, had just acknowledged us, way, 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 way back. And so I'm just trying to help crack the structures that we built that are rooted in very deep harm that not only harm us as trans queer people, but cis people too. I feel like there's so many limitations that cis people face as well because of the gender binary and the roles that they think they need to play.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I'm struck by something you said a little bit earlier, that realizing that you could exist, realizing that there were queer trans people out there, there were BIPOC queer people out there living life and being happy and being okay. Because I feel like that's something that so many LGBTQ folks across generations can understand or relate to, that first moment where we saw that we could exist. We saw that there was a future. Um, and that identity formation journey was a critical part of it because you got connected to that community from doing all of that self exploration work. Another thing that I heard there was this idea that we all could use a little bit more space outside of the binary, not just trans people, not just us gender fluid folks over in a corner. Like everyone could benefit from this. And that's something that I find sometimes really surprises cis people, that this idea that they have a gender and they're interacting with these things every single day. But it's so true. If everyone invested in uh, kind of this degendering of their experiences, I do think more doors would open for everyone. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think that goes into why collective liberation is so important because when you free the people that are most impacted by systemic oppression, it liberates all of us. It just creates so much expansion and flexibility for anyone involved, even if you have a conventional dominant identity in this world, you'd be surprised at how many roles you unconsciously play. Whether that's like the way you move around the world, the clothes you choose to wear, the way you hold your body, how you speak,
Yeah.
it is definitely, we are socialized through so many different filters that I believe people are unaware of. And trans people, disabled people, anyone who lives in this othered marginalization category has had to unpack that to exist. But there's so much beauty in that because now we see it from the outside in, and we're like, wow, we don't need this. Why are we all doing this way? Um, and it's so freeing because you begin to realize there are so many other possibilities of ways to live your life. And I wish that other people who have more conventional dominant identities were open to understanding that.
Yeah. I hope that this conversation can be one nudge in the right direction for folks who might still be in that experience. Fingers crossed, right? Okay, so I want to switch gears here. You are very, very open about the way that being deaf impacts your daily life in a way that I think is, again, eye opening for a lot of people who don't often interact with, touch base with the disability community. And I really especially appreciate your openness about just how exhausting it is navigating hearing spaces as a deaf person. And I imagine this is something that other disabled and neurodiverse folks can relate to. I know I certainly talk about sensory issues with a lot of my communities who are neurodiverse, and it's very hard even in that context. So knowing that we're speaking to these diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioners, what steps can we, as the people creating these inclusive spaces, take to make a work environment more accessible for deaf and hard of hearing folks?
Another great question. There are so many resources, honestly, that exist out there created by disabled people. There's Disability Visibility, which is an incredible website that has a huge plethora of resources for all kinds of accessibility. Um, Tilting the Lens is a new organization that was just established where you can hire authentically disabled people. Very important. Make sure if you're dealing with disability, you hire people who are actually disabled, please. And thank you. So, Tilting the Lens is another really great organization. Um, and they can be brought on in, I believe, any kind of project and connect you with disabled folks who are, willing to speak to you about what exactly is the event at hand, and these are all the potential ways that it could be made more accessible. Perhaps it's having live captions on a video call. Perhaps it's hiring an ASL interpreter. Perhaps it's having a place for people to sit who can't stand for long periods of time. Perhaps it's having a more quiet room for people who are neurodiverse and are feeling very overstimulated and just need to sit and like maybe whip out some stim toys and relax for a little bit. Or maybe it's, having braille available or audio descriptions involved in a gallery show. For example, I'm working right now on a gallery show that's all disabled folks, and we hired Tilting the Lens, and they've been incredible in the ways that, you know, they are dealing with physical mobility issues like putting in a ramp or even just like the text on the walls. It's a lot easier, I learned recently, for people who are blind or who have low vision to read not just all caps, because when the letters are more diverse, it's easier for them to pick up. So it's just different, and sometimes disabilities even counteract each other. Sometimes it's literally impossible for one space to be fully inclusive and accessible for everyone because the way it could be inclusive for one person might not for another. For example, if you're blind, sometimes the ways that you interact with the world is through auditory, right? Like through listening. But for me, that is not accessible at all. And I'm very more like visually oriented. So it depends, Um, the safest thing to do at the end of the day is ask who's coming, if they have a disability, how they need to be accommodated, and then just do it.
Yeah, I 100%. And I remember my mind being blown in college when I realized that there was no way that we were ever going to achieve universal accessibility for everyone for the very reason that you
Oh,
mentioned. I was like, oh my God, wait, but you can't do that. And then I went through the whole list and realized, no, of course you can't. It's common sense in
right,
some
right.
ways.
Exactly. But I think there's so much beauty in that, in the same ways that we can't ever have a utopia. It's literally just because humans are different in more ways than our abilities, in our emotions, in our everything, So we just can't have this perfect world for everyone because everyone's idea of what perfect is differentiates.
And I think this really speaks to something that diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioners are grappling with every day, this idea that we actually need equity. Equity being that not everyone's going to need the same size shoes. Some of us are going to need smaller shoes or bigger shoes or shoes with platforms or more arch support. Whatever it is, there needs to be that tailored approach to the community, to
Right.
the individual. And that's a hard thing to do. But to your point, it's just necessary at the end of the day to make sure that folks we want in the space can actually participate in the space. So, a question, because this was all sort of in the workplace context, do the same principles of asking for what accessibility folks need and then doing it, does that still apply in social settings?
Absolutely. I think it definitely still applies. And I think you can just, in social settings or more intimate settings, be more conscious of how public your ask is. So sometimes, there's like a doodle poll you could send people before an event. Or if you're just in a group of friends, you could pull your other friend aside and just be like, hey, I wanted to check in, not like in front of everyone. Like I wouldn't say in front of the whole group, be like, hey, do you like require any support right now? Like pull them aside and be like, hey, I was just thinking about you. Just let me know if you need anything, I'm here. And that's it. And that person can I assure you, a lot of disabled individuals learn very quickly how to accommodate for themselves, especially if they have been disabled since birth or have been disabled throughout childhood. So just ask, as long as you're polite and coming from a place of compassion, it means a lot, even that people think to ask.
Yeah. That I think leads into this next question I have. And I'm going to preface it by saying I think it's fair to say that we are both young, pretty young, right? We're in our 20s. And relatively speaking, we're in the early stages of our careers. We're still learning how we want to navigate the professional world, the working world, as people with a ton of intersecting identities. Is there anything that you think companies should know about intersectionality or identity or allyship, or about how to make workplaces more accessible that maybe we didn't just cover? Anything that would have made your experiences entering into this working world better, easier, smoother?
There's so much to say. I don't know where to begin. I think the most important thing is coming from a place of authentic support and not performative support. truly making sure that whoever you bring on that does have intersections within their identity or just has not been welcomed into spaces where they could have power before, when you reach out to them, make sure that it's coming from a place of authenticity. Make sure that you care about them, that when you ask them, hey, what do you need? You're asking them because you will work to make it happen, not because you are asking that question because you know it should be asked. Ask because you care. And then do your best to fulfill that and like work with them on that. um I believe there's so much tokenization and performativity, especially in companies, and having just one, but ideally everyone, but having authentic people behind the name of that company who truly care about the people that they're working with is a game changer. And not only does it change the experiences of those people involved directly, but it can shift the way the company itself is structured and allow for a safer, more healthier environment. I mean, even people who aren't at these intersections, everyone deserves to just be asked sometimes how they're feeling and if they need anything when working inside of a company, or just because like they're a human being. um so just check in with your people and make sure that the check-ins are fueled by love and compassion.
Yeah. This is something that I think we often in this field categorize as empathetic leadership. Exactly what you've just hit on, this idea that we need to be willing to extend care in ways that might seem counterproductive in a workplace setting in order to actually get the best results out of our people. And there have certainly been studies shown that empathetic leaders do better. They have better outcomes. They have higher performance in their teams, higher camaraderie and trust on their teams. And I know that when we talk about leadership at Out and Equal, so often people say, oh, yeah, the leaders I remember were the ones who cared about me, who did ask, how are you doing? What do you need? Oh, that was a great idea. Where do you want to go with it? So I really love that. And so much of allyship is just getting to know the person, asking what they need. Hey, do you need, a ramp or a chair while you're getting to the event? There are going to be 3 steps going up to the building, FYI. Communicating clearly about what you're doing, what you can do, and what isn't possible right now, but what you can work towards in the future. I think is a huge kind of additional component to this added layer of transparency that you're calling out.
Absolutely, absolutely. And also, it's a matter of when you ask the questions as well. I would just ask everyone to be mindful of that. For example, if there's an event, don't ask the day of what accommodations they need. Plan ahead and make sure that, because this is coming from a place of authenticity and compassion, that you're wanting to dedicate time to making sure these answers can be fulfilled.
Yeah. Oh wow! So we have. I think we could keep going for hours here, but I know that we want to start wrapping this conversation up. So my last question for you, it's a big one again, so sorry in advance. But I know I want to look at your book Continuum because it came out last year and it is this beautifully written, really authentic and honest reflection on your identity formation and how you've come to be who you are. Among many other things. And I'm struck by the fact that so much of your work hinges on your ability to tell your story. And even at your TED Talk, which I believe happened very early on in your career, relatively speaking, your story is the center. Your story is the thing that's tugging on people's hearts and minds and making that change. And that's a really hard thing to do. to tell a story in that way. Um, and it's something we're always trying to help folks learn how to do better. So, as a storyteller, what advice can you give to someone who's just starting to consider sharing their story with the world?
Hmm. Well, thank you. First of all, thank you for saying all of that. I really appreciate all of your kind words, and I'm really touched that my story is resonating with so many people because it honestly makes me feel so much less alone. Because I wrote that because I felt like no one had told me the things that I was saying to myself. And it's so overwhelmingly healing to know how relatable it is to people that are alive right now. But for people that want to begin telling their story, honestly, just begin. It's impossible to pick this perfect place to begin. You know, your life story is everything. That's a lot. There's a lot to share about that. So go where your heart is pulling you, where you feel like holds the most emotion. That's typically the best place to start. And then from there, things will just come out. Life, although we are presented in our culture here in America, that the timeline is very linear, it's very non linear. And I believe the way that we tell our stories is sometimes best as well when it's nonlinear. That doesn't mean eventually you have to present it that way. You can always, take all the things that are coming out of you and like clean it up, organize it, have it be a narrative tale linearly if you so wish. I mean, there's also a bunch of incredible books and stories that are told non-linearly that are just as maybe if not more powerful, but just begin where you feel, and don't have expectations or try not. I mean, that's like very, very, very hard to do. Try not to have expectations about, you know, where this story will live. When you write it for you. That's very important. When you create art, when you do anything, I really hope that you have the privilege and the space and the ability to do it because you want to do it, not because other people are telling you to do it. Because when you do things for other people, the things that you do start to not become yours anymore. So I would say when you tell your story, make sure it's because you're wanting to tell your story first and foremost. And that whether or not people relate to it, is not the point. Shouldn't be the point. I think the point is that you feel like your heart is on the table and that your story was told. And that's it.
Yeah. Well, I cannot think of a better way to wrap up our conversation than on that beautiful note. Make sure that your story is your own the whole way through. And that's a hard thing to do, but something that I'm sure everyone in our audience is going to start taking a page out of your book to really emulate that method, because I think, again, you do it very, very well. So thank you
Thank
so,
you.
so much, Chella, for giving us your time and your insight and your story over the last, 30, 40 minutes that we've been together. It's really been a pleasure, and we are so excited to be able to share this with the world. Thank you again.
Likewise, and thank you for your questions and holding space so like delicately and gently. I really appreciate the energy that you brought.
Thank you. Well, maybe we'll get to do it again sometime.
Absolutely.